On a gray, overcast morning in the heart of Maplewood, a quiet, tight-knit town known for its long-held traditions, a disturbing scene was about to unfold in the courthouse. Judge Harold Simmons, a man whose reputation for strictness had long intimidated even the most law-abiding citizens, was presiding over a seemingly routine case. In the crowded courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation and hushed whispers. Today's case was to determine the fate of Mrs. Lillian Brooks, an elderly black woman known throughout Maplewood for her kind heart, gentle smile, and unwavering honesty. As the proceedings began, Judge Simmons wasted no time. His gavel struck the sound block with an authority that sent shivers down the spines of those present. With a voice that brooked no argument, he began listing charges against Mrs. Brooks, charges that, to everyone's shock, seemed not to stem from any real evidence, but rather from a personal bias that he had long harbored. "This woman is a threat to the integrity of our community," he declared, his tone cold and imperious. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the murmur of disbelieving whispers. Mrs. Brooks, her eyes wide with fear, yet filled with a quiet dignity, listened as the judge recited fabricated claims that painted her as a dangerous criminal. In that charged moment, it became clear that this was not about justice. It was about power, prejudice, and a determination to silence a voice deemed undesirable. The injustice was palpable, and even those who usually kept silent felt the sting of witnessing something profoundly wrong. But just as the judge's verdict seemed inevitable, a sudden shift rippled through the courtroom. With trembling hands, Mrs. Brooks reached for a small, well-worn cell phone clutched tightly in her frail grasp. As the judge prepared to deliver his sentence, she dialed a number that would change everything. In a voice that trembled only slightly, imbued with a lifetime of perseverance, she called her son. And on the other end of that line was not just any family member, but the U.S. Attorney General, a man whose career was built on fighting injustice at the highest levels. In that instant, the dynamics in the courtroom shifted. The judge, the witnesses, and even the hardened jurors found themselves caught between the harsh reality of prejudice and the promise of accountability. The fate of Mrs. Brooks was suddenly no longer a local matter. It was about to become a case that would challenge the very foundations of power and prejudice in Maplewood. Maplewood was a town steeped in history, a place where every street corner told stories of past glories and lingering secrets. Elegant colonial houses lined the quiet streets, and the local courthouse, with its imposing columns and marble steps, stood as a testament to the community's long-held belief in law and order. However, beneath the polished exterior of tradition lay an undercurrent of tension, a legacy of bias that had seeped into the crevices of local institutions. At the center of this unfolding drama was Mrs. Lillian Brooks, an elderly black woman whose life had been defined by kindness and resilience. Lillian had lived in Maplewood all her life. Widowed young, she raised her children on a modest income, always putting others' needs before her own. Known for her warm smile, gentle advice, and unwavering honesty, Lillian was respected by many. Yet for some, her humble origins and unassuming nature marked her as an outsider, a fact that had unfortunately made her the target of unfounded suspicions. Opposing her in the courtroom was Judge Harold Simmons, a man in his late 60s with a stern countenance and a reputation for uncompromising authority. Simmons had served Maplewood for decades and was known for his rigid interpretations of the law. His courtroom was a stage where he projected his personal views as objective justice. Over the years, murmurs had circulated about his bias, a bias that now reared its ugly head against Lillian, an innocent soul with nothing to hide. The courthouse itself was a grand structure that symbolized the town's commitment to order. Inside, high ceilings and polished wood panels created an atmosphere of solemnity, while rows of seats filled with local citizens bore witness to the day's proceedings. Outside, the manicured lawns and historic facades of Maplewood painted an idyllic picture, one that contrasted sharply with the injustice taking place within its walls. Unbeknownst to many in Maplewood, Lillian's son, Derek Brooks had risen to prominence on a national stage. Now serving as the U.S. Attorney General, Derek had dedicated his career to fighting injustice and dismantling the very systems that had once oppressed people like his mother. His journey from the humble streets of Maplewood to the highest echelons of power was a story of determination, sacrifice, and an unwavering belief in the rule of law. Though he had been estranged from the local community for years, Derek's love for his mother had never wavered. On that fateful day, as the courtroom's tension mounted and Judge Simmons' harsh words echoed off the walls, the stage was set for a dramatic collision between entrenched prejudice and the resolute spirit of justice embodied by Derek Brooks. The townspeople, accustomed to a quiet adherence to tradition, were about to witness a turning point that would challenge every assumption about fairness and equality in their beloved Maplewood. Every detail, the subdued lighting, the somber expressions on familiar faces, and the palpable hush of anticipation hinted at the fact that the events unfolding were far more than a simple legal proceeding. They were a reckoning, a moment when the deep-rooted injustices of the past would finally be confronted and, perhaps, rectified. The tension in the courtroom was thick, almost suffocating, as Judge Simmons laid out a series of fabricated charges against Mrs. Lillian Brooks. His voice, measured yet filled with cold conviction, recited a litany of offenses that Lillian had never committed. "You have conspired to undermine the moral fabric of this community," he declared, his tone rising as he spoke. Each word felt like a deliberate strike against a woman who had spent her entire life embodying decency and compassion. Lillian sat motionless in the defendant's chair, her frail hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. The weight of injustice was evident in the sorrowful look in her eyes, a look that held decades of hardship and unspoken resilience. Meanwhile, the gallery of local citizens watched in stunned silence. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged glances that spoke of shared disbelief. It was clear that many had come to respect Lillian for her contributions to the community, and now they were forced to witness her being unfairly condemned. Across the room, Karen Whitman, who had initiated the 911 call with her narrow-minded fervor, stood near the back. Her face, previously set in a mask of self-righteous indignation, began to betray a hint of uncertainty as the proceedings continued. She had been convinced that she was protecting the sanctity of Maplewood by denouncing Lillian. Instead, her actions were exposing a deep-seated prejudice that was now under intense scrutiny. As the judge's fabricated charges piled up, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Whispers grew louder as a few brave citizens began to question the validity of the accusations. "This doesn't add up," one neighbor murmured, while another leaned over to a friend. "We all know Lillian. She's never done anything wrong." The collective sentiment was one of mounting disbelief, a growing recognition that something was deeply amiss. At that critical moment, Lillian's trembling fingers reached for her cell phone, an old device that had been her constant companion. With a slow, deliberate motion, she dialed a number that had long been etched in her heart, a number that belonged to her only son, Derek Brooks. The courtroom's murmur faltered as the phone rang. Time seemed to slow as the call connected, and a calm, authoritative voice answered. "Hello," came the reply, a voice that carried the weight of national responsibility and the promise of justice. Within seconds, a palpable shift occurred. The digital evidence from earlier, security footage showing the innocuous actions of Lillian juxtaposed against the aggressive behavior of Karen had already begun circulating among the onlookers. The crowd's attention pivoted to the unfolding drama on the screen, and the true nature of the injustice was laid bare. Meanwhile, as Derek listened intently on the other end of the line, his voice grew steady and resolute. "Mother, stay strong. I'm on my way," he said, a single phrase that carried the promise of intervention and accountability. As the call continued, Judge Simmons and the other officials in the courtroom exchanged uneasy glances. The revelation that Lillian's son was none other than the U.S. Attorney General was a twist that none had anticipated. In that moment, Every fabricated accusation and every unjust charge began to crumble under the weight of undeniable truth. The digital recordings, the eyewitness testimonies, and now the intervention of a powerful figure in national law enforcement all converged to challenge the deep-rooted bias that had fueled the entire proceeding. The conflict buildup reached its peak as tension mounted not only in the courtroom, but throughout the community of Maplewood. The story of a woman, branded as guilty by prejudice, was now at a crossroads. Every whispered word and every exchanged look among the gallery of local citizens reflected a collective realization that justice must prevail and that no one, regardless of their past or status, was above the law. By the close of the day, as the call from Derek reverberated through the silent courtroom, the stage was set for a dramatic escalation. The very foundations of Maplewood's justice system were about to be challenged, and the powerful intersection of deep-rooted prejudice and the unyielding force of truth had ignited a spark that would soon engulf the entire community. In the days that followed, the scandal reverberated far beyond the courthouse walls of Maplewood. Social media exploded with posts and videos of the courtroom drama, and hashtags such as hashtag Justice for Lillian and hashtag Brooks for Change trended both locally and nationally. Residents of Maplewood, long accustomed to a quiet conformity, found themselves awakened by the stark injustice that had unfolded before their eyes. The incident became a rallying cry for those who demanded accountability from the very institutions that were meant to protect them. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon detailed reports chronicled every aspect of the trial. Interviews with stunned neighbors and sympathetic community members revealed that Lillian Brooks had long been a beloved figure in Maplewood, someone who had devoted her life to helping others. "I've known Lillian since I was a child," said one longtime resident. "She's the heart and soul of this community. To see her treated this way is an outrage." These voices, filled with emotion and indignation, added fuel to the fire of public outcry. Within the courthouse, the digital evidence, captured by security cameras and confirmed by multiple eyewitnesses, began to turn the tide of opinion. Every recorded clip, every shared social media post, painted a vivid picture of the unfounded nature of the charges. The evidence showed Lillian calmly going about her day, contrasting sharply with the aggressive, biased actions of Karen Whitman, whose false claims had sparked the entire ordeal. As more and more of this evidence surfaced, it became clear that the entire proceeding was built on a foundation of prejudice. At the same time, the news of Lillian's call to her son reached the ears of influential figures beyond Maplewood. Derek Brooks, the U.S. Attorney General and Lillian's estranged son, swiftly began coordinating with local authorities to review the case. His intervention sent shockwaves through the community and the media alike. Derek, known for his uncompromising stance on justice and equality, vowed that no one would be allowed to manipulate the legal system with personal bias. "We are here to ensure that every citizen, regardless of background, is treated with the dignity they deserve," he stated in a televised address, his voice resolute and inspiring. The pressure on the local authorities grew immense. Community leaders, civil rights organizations, and even national watchdog groups began calling for a complete overhaul of the procedures that had allowed such a miscarriage of justice. Town hall meetings were convened, where residents demanded that not only be Karen Whitman held accountable for her actions, but that the entire system be scrutinized to root out any lingering biases. "We cannot allow prejudice to dictate how we dispense justice," one local activist proclaimed during a heated public forum. "It's time for real change." Within the walls of Maplewood's legal establishment, the internal investigation that had begun in the courthouse expanded rapidly. Every digital log, every security tape, and every witness statement was meticulously reviewed. The investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior by Karen Whitman that had, until now, been hidden behind the facade of civic duty. The revelations were damning. Multiple past incidents, once dismissed as misunderstandings, now pointed to a deliberate, recurring bias that targeted those who did not fit a narrow, outdated profile of acceptable citizens. As the internal review gained momentum, the public's fury grew. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with demonstrators holding signs like "Every Voice Matters" and "Stop Prejudice Now." Social media became a battleground for voices demanding accountability and transparency. News anchors and panel discussions debated the broader implications of the case. How a single 911 call, born of deep-seated prejudice, had exposed systemic flaws in a community's legal and social fabric. In the midst of this escalating chaos, Derek Brooks, the U.S. Attorney General, began to make public appearances in Maplewood. His arrival was met with a mixture of awe and relief. In interviews, he spoke passionately about the need to rebuild trust in public institutions and to ensure that justice was administered without bias. "Today, we stand at a crossroads," he declared during a press conference. "We have a responsibility to each other to confront our prejudices and to create a system where every citizen is valued, no matter their background." His words, broadcast on national television, resonated with millions and lent an undeniable weight to the call for change. Every new piece of digital evidence, every supportive testimonial, and every protest added layers to the rising tension. The once stern courthouse of Maplewood was now transformed into a symbol of the community's determination to expose and eradicate injustice. The internal investigation, bolstered by public pressure, promised a reckoning that would force every institution involved to confront its own biases. The narrative had shifted from one of personal grievance to a broader, systemic call for accountability, a movement that demanded that no act of prejudice be allowed to stand without consequence. As the days turned into a turbulent week, the cumulative pressure reached its peak. The entire community held its breath, knowing that the final resolution was imminent. A moment when the truth would be laid bare and the perpetrators of discrimination would finally face the full force of justice. The stage was set for the ultimate turning point, a dramatic climax that would not only redefine the fate of Lillian Brooks and Karen Whitman, but also reshape the values of Maplewood itself. The decisive moment came on a crisp morning in a packed conference room at the Maplewood Community Center. Senior city officials, representatives from the local police department, community leaders, and media personnel had gathered to hear the final resolution of the investigation into the 911 call and the ensuing trial. With a calm yet determined presence, Councilwoman Janice Thompson stepped up to the podium. After an exhaustive review of all digital records, security footage, and eyewitness testimonies, we have reached a conclusion that leaves no room for doubt, she began, her voice resonating with authority and compassion. It is evident that the 911 call made by Mrs. Karen Whitman was not based on any factual disturbance, but was a manifestation of deep-rooted prejudice, a prejudice that has no place in our community. Her words echoed through the room, stirring a deep, collective resolve among those present. Councilwoman Thompson continued, "Effective immediately, Mrs. Whitman's record of discriminatory calls will be subject to a full disciplinary review. Our commitment to justice and equality demands that every act of hate be met with accountability. No one in Maplewood shall be allowed to use public resources as a weapon against innocent citizens." Her clear, unwavering declaration was met with murmurs of approval and a few nods of resolute understanding from the assembled officials and community representatives. At that moment, a dignified voice broke through the tense silence, a voice belonging to Mr. David Carter, a respected community leader and representative of the affected family. "I stand here not in anger, but in hope," he said, his tone measured yet filled with quiet power. "We have long suffered in silence, but today we reclaim our dignity. Let this be a turning point, a moment when every act of prejudice is met with the full force of justice. We will not allow hate to define our community any longer." His words were met with resounding applause, the sound of unity and determination echoing around the room. Following Mr. Carter's impassioned speech, a senior police official presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of digital evidence, internal memos, and eyewitness testimonies that irrefutably documented Mrs. Whitman's repeated misuse of emergency services. Every piece of evidence reinforced the truth that her actions were driven by bias, not by any legitimate disturbance. The Internal Affairs Panel, now unanimous in its decision, confirmed that the disciplinary measures would be both swift and far-reaching. The turning point was sealed as Councilwoman Thompson concluded, "Today, we say enough is enough. The legacy of prejudice must end here and now. Maplewood will stand as a community where every voice is valued and every act of discrimination is met with immediate accountability." Her words, delivered with unwavering conviction, marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter for Maplewood, one defined by transparency, equality, and true justice. In that charged moment, the faces in the room, some stern with resolve, others soft with relief, spoke of a community united in its demand for change. The decision to subject Mrs. Whitman to a full disciplinary review, combined with the public's unwavering call for reform, shifted the balance of power irreversibly. The scandal that had once threatened to fracture Maplewood was now being transformed into a beacon of accountability, and every individual present understood that no act of hate would ever be allowed to stand unchallenged again. In the weeks following the decisive conference, Maplewood began a gradual process of healing and transformation. News of the full disciplinary review into Mrs. Karen Whitman's discriminatory 911 calls spread rapidly through local media and social networks, igniting a citywide dialogue about accountability, justice, and a need for systemic reform. The once somber headlines gave way to hopeful stories of change, and the public's outrage gradually turned into a collective resolve to build a more inclusive future. Mr. David Carter and other community leaders organized a series of town hall meetings and public forums, where residents shared their own experiences with injustice and discussed concrete steps toward preventing such abuses in the future. "Our community has been scarred by bias for far too long," one local activist declared at a bustling meeting. "Today, we come together to ensure that every voice is heard and every act of hate is met with swift, decisive action." His words resonated deeply with many, galvanizing a new wave of activism that promised to reshape Maplewood's cultural landscape. Within the local police department, the internal review led to sweeping changes. Senior officials implemented rigorous training programs focused on cultural sensitivity, ethical conduct, and the proper use of emergency services. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established, ensuring that every complaint of discrimination would be taken seriously and addressed promptly. "We owe it to our community to uphold the highest standards of integrity," declared Director Samuel Green in a follow-up press conference. His commitment to reform was met with cautious optimism by both officers and citizens alike. At the same time, the incident spurred broader discussions about the role of public trust in institutions. Local government officials, in collaboration with civil rights organizations, began drafting new policies aimed at preventing the misuse of 911 services and reinforcing the principles of equality and fairness in all public interactions. The community rallied behind these initiatives, and a series of public service campaigns were launched under banners like "Every Life Matters" and "Justice for All." For Mrs. Lillian Brooks, the ordeal that had begun with a prejudiced 911 call had ultimately become a catalyst for change. Her quiet dignity in the face of injustice had inspired countless residents to question long-held biases and demand a higher standard of accountability. In interviews, she spoke softly of hope and resilience, urging her neighbors to look beyond prejudice and embrace the values of compassion and truth. "I have always believed that every person deserves respect," she said. "Today, I see that our community is beginning to understand that true justice comes from acknowledging our past mistakes and committing to change." By the time Central City's Maplewood community gathered for a final celebratory event at the local park, the mood had shifted dramatically. Under the gentle glow of the setting sun, neighbors, officials, and community leaders assembled to honor the progress made. A large banner reading "Justice and Unity for All" hung between the park's ancient oak trees, and speeches filled the air with messages of hope, accountability, and a collective commitment to a fair future. In his closing remarks, Councilwoman Janice Thompson declared, "Today we celebrate not just a victory over prejudice, but the promise of a new era for our community. Let this day remind us that no act of hate can prevail when we stand together in the name of truth and justice." Her words were met with a chorus of applause, a resounding affirmation that Maplewood had turned a painful chapter into the foundation of lasting reform. As Central City slowly returned to its daily rhythm, the legacy of that fateful day endured as a beacon of hope and transformation. The story of how a baseless 911 call, fueled by deep-rooted prejudice, was dismantled by truth and accountability became a powerful reminder that every voice matters. Maplewood emerged stronger, its people more united, and its institutions forever changed by the courage to confront injustice head-on. And as each new day dawned over the community, it carried with it the promise that the light of integrity would always overcome the shadows of hate.